rifts, culture wars, catfights. Those are things that have always existed in movements because that's how movements work. And feminisms have never been a monolith.
Feminism has been shown as white women fighting for voting rights, or white women fighting for the right to be equal to white men. I absolutely think there's a cultural war happening, and that's because some of us don't believe in everyone else's struggles.
You know, there's not actually a lot of evidence that women vote for women. Frankly, I'd want to think really hard about why we would expect there to be.
One of the things that's holding women back is class conflict. That is making feminist claims implausible or indeed sometimes distasteful to other groups.
I think it's easy to forget progress that has been made. If we can focus our political energies on the needs of folks who are most marginalized, then folks who are less marginalized will necessarily also be liberated.
I'm Rachel Didekoffer. I am the election forecaster at the Niskanen Center in Washington, D.C. I'm also the host of the Election Whisperer and all-around kind of data girl. Graduate school turned me into a feminist. It really made me cognizant of the need to lend my ball-crushing abilities to intentional patriarchy smashing. You know what? I'm sensitive to why so many women don't call themselves a feminist, because I think there was a time period in my life where I would have not said I was a feminist, and it's purely a branding issue, right? The right has allowed the word to become dirty, and the left has not answered that in an affirmative way.
The question is, does all of this stuff, all this rhetoric, all these politics actually do anything for women? Are they better off? Are they happier than they were, say, 50 years ago when it all began?
Women thought they were going to elect a female president, you know, and it's a classic don't count your chickens before they hatch sense for sure, but there was a sense that women had accomplished breaking the ultimate glass ceiling.
This is really your victory, and if there are any little girls out there who stayed up late to watch, let me just say, I may become the first woman president, but one of you is next. Thank you all. I can't wait to join you in Philadelphia.
You know, there's many people, I think, who understood that a Trump presidency were going to have massive implications for them. And one of those groups were women. And I mean, you could see it on the faces of women watching election coverage that night.
The scene here is so different than it was a few hours ago when people were happy and relaxed. I have been looking around the room at people who are stone-faced. Some of them have been crying.
If you have a candidate who says the words, grab her by the you-know-what, caught on tape, and women are still voting for him.
Hard to understand.
It's appalling.
Incandescent rage, right? I think that's how women have felt since 2016. They have felt an incandescent rage to realize that a highly qualified woman who did everything, execute A, B, C, D, E, and F to achieve this goal, and then to get that close would be thwarted in that effort.
This is my bill made by one of my daughters. Everyone, of course, knows I'm only a bill, and of course, if your mother's a political scientist, you have to watch it. This is my DNC bear. I took my daughters, who were much younger then, to the 2016 DNC convention. I was wearing my "Someday a Woman Will Be President" t-shirt. Things did not go well. I am obligated to say to you that there is no women's vote. I'm very sorry, but it does not exist. We keep looking for it. We've been looking for it since 1920, and it's really never been there. We know across really most racial and ethnic groups, across most class groups as well, women are more likely to vote for Democrats for most offices than are men. The problem is when you hear that, to say women are more likely to vote for Democrats sounds like most women are Democrats. In fact, it's not true. So if we're talking about white women, we know that a majority of white women voted Republican in 2016 and have voted Republican for most of the last 20 to 40 years. We know that the vast majority of Black women voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016. The United States is one of the only democracies in the world that has never elected a woman as its national leader. We see ourselves as this long-standing beacon of democracy, but to the extent that this highest office in the land has not been open to everybody, because it wasn't just that we didn't get our first woman as president, but that she lost to a candidate who seems to embody these other values, who is known for saying sexist things about women, who was credibly accused of doing those sorts of things against women. And so I think for many people, putting those two pieces together, 2016 was really a wake-up call. In some ways, you might even say radicalizing, especially for young women.
Preserve, protect, and defend
the Constitution of the United States.
the Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Donald J. Trump is now President of the United States. President Obama.
We want to take you to D.C. We've been monitoring the Women's March coming out of Washington and across the entire world. Thousands of people nationwide.
Organizers, I believe, were not prepared for the number of people who actually attended here in D.C. They were expecting about 200,000, and organizers tell us there were about 500,000. I actually think that number could be even higher.
I am woman, hear me roar!
The way that it manifested was in political activism, and I think there was a temptation to point to the Women's March and say, oh, what are they going to do? Go to DC in pink pussy hats and yell and wave signs, whoop-de-doo. But it was quite clear it was going to be a substantive and transformative movement.
White women do not own feminism.
I do not actually identify as a feminist, funny enough, right? But I identify as a womanist, which womanism is something that was established by Black women, actually, in order to talk about what it means for race, class, sexism, and where all of those intersections lie, and Black women being able to push forward the agenda of everyone being equal. My involvement with Women's March started after President Trump was elected because the people in the community wanted to see more diversity. And from there, it led me into being the chapter lead for the Pensacola Women's March chapter of Women's March Florida. I really wanted to be involved because there was such a lack of Black women, and I am part of a coalition of people that include transgender women, genderqueer, feminine presenting people, and those that are working class women, single mothers, and also those that are married and doing reproductive work. The first Women's March brought out a knitted pink hat that was like cat ears, and it was called the pussy hat.
What are these hats called?
These are called pussy hats.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think is the reason for them?
It's because of what Donald Trump said about grabbing women without their consent, which is not okay.
There was really this focus on bioessentialism of vaginas meaning women. That was equal to, and that, the way it looked in the optics was all women have vaginas, all vaginas are pink, and things of that nature. I myself, I identify as genderqueer. And moving forward in Women's March, we wanted it to be known that, wear your pussy hat, but please understand that those that make up the diversity of this really strong pot and melting pot of women aren't gonna necessarily feel safe with you, because it brings across this idea that all women have vaginas, and we have a very tight-knit, beautiful community of transgender women right here in Pensacola. I absolutely think there's a cultural war happening, and that's because some of us don't believe in everyone else's struggles. If we're really invested into the struggles of all women, of all people that are feminine presenting, of all people that were even born and assigned female at birth, then we would not have these cultural wars. We wouldn't have the issues of people saying, well, this part of your feminism isn't important, which it always is.
I don't think it was overplayed. I think the Pussy Hats came to symbolize a bigger debate in feminist politics, which is, to what extent is feminism about women, and who or what is a woman anyway? For some folks, really became a symbol of all that was wrong with contemporary feminist politics and organizing. So I don't think it was so much about the hat itself, right, as these kind of larger debates that had been circulating in feminist organizing for some time. Intersectionality is a theory of how power works. So it's a theory that believes that folks who are most vulnerable and most marginalized see how power works with an insightfulness and a clarity that we should all learn from. I think the way that second wave feminism gets talked about, it's this story about white women struggling for the inclusion of white women and for securing formal rights. So, rights around employment discrimination, rights around healthcare, rights around sexual freedom, birth control, and the like. And so in that story, feminism was really organized around the interests of not just white women, but particular kinds of white women, heterosexual white women, affluent white women. And yet, in this same moment that we call second wave feminism, there are so many Black women, Latinx women writing, organizing, engaged in political activity that often gets written out of the history of so-called second wave feminism, because as we narrativize second wave feminism, it's always about white women. If we can focus our political energies on the needs of folks who are most marginalized, then folks who are less marginalized will necessarily also be liberated. We need a social movement that can think about the logics of race and gender simultaneously.
I don't remember how I became a feminist. I think I just started picking up on patterns of how girls were talked to, what was expected of them, just the kind of normal double standards. I think a lot of what people see in contemporary feminism as, rifts or culture wars, we just all know about them now because so much of activism is performed in public, online. And feminisms have never been a monolith. And you have some basic philosophical points on which not everyone is going to agree, because that's how movements work. And so, you hear feminists saying, well, the first wave feminists, were racist, or the second wave feminists were transphobic, and the third wave feminists were just completely focused on themselves and not on organizing. There's always been this rejection of what is perceived as kind of the dominant rhetoric or attitude of the generation that came before. And I think for feminism, fairly or not, it often is understood as a kind of mother-daughter split, where you have these young upstarts being like, well, no, I don't want to do your marching in the street. I want to do something else. But I think ultimately, we are all still working for the opportunities and the autonomy, the fact that, women still often are not paid equally to men for the same work.
My definition of feminism is very broad. Any woman who believes we should empower women, to me, that's a feminist. One of the things that's holding women back is class conflict. that is making feminist claims implausible or indeed sometimes distasteful to other groups. So I think that one of the things that keeps driving American politics to the right, including in an anti-feminist direction, is our class cluelessness, our blindness to social class dynamics that are behind these culture wars that have been so powerfully effective in bonding the business elite to the kind of ordinary Joe, ordinary Jane, blue-collar Americans. Again, a classic feminist is someone like me. I was born privileged by race, privileged by social class. The only thing that kept me from going to the top was gender. And so that felt very problematic to me. But women who were very different than me, either because they just embraced more traditional roles, even though they were demographically like me, or more likely women who were never going to go to the top because they were not class privileged, often identify more with women's traditional roles as a source of power. And they feel that what feminists should be really focusing on is revaluing women's traditional roles rather than trying to undermine them. If you care about women's rights, if you care about reproductive rights, if you care about climate change, if you care about so many issues, you have to think about what those issues would look like if we didn't have these constant culture wars. And one of the things that's also been fascinating for me is to see the rising of women of color as candidates.
November elections will bring a record number of women to the ballot.
A record-breaking number of women ran in the midterms and won.
I'm particularly proud to be the woman Speaker of the House of this Congress, which marks the 100th year of women having the right to vote.
It was bigger than the historic wave in the 1990s and 1994, which was the previous year of the women, and had held the record for more than 2 decades. And now, the 2018 class has been eclipsed by the 2020 class.
We couldn't have a better candidate than the next congresswoman from this district, Lauren Underwood. Take it away, Lauren.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad to be here with you. I'm Lauren Underwood, running for Congress. I grew up here in Naperville, Illinois. I'm a registered nurse. At the time that I launched, several men that were already in the race, and so I was a long shot by far. But we were able to decisively win a primary. I beat 6 guys and got 57% of the vote. And then in November of 2018, I won against a 4-term Tea Party Republican. I won all 7 counties in my district, and I won the election by 5 points. As female candidates, as candidates of color, and as young candidates, we run into these electability concerns because of this, conventional wisdom that said a 30-year-old Black woman couldn't flip a congressional district in suburban Chicago. My congressional district is less than 3% Black. And so, I am a unique candidate. I am, a barrier breaker in many ways, becoming the first woman and first person of color to represent this community.
Heavy snowflakes didn't stop hundreds from coming out to Neuqua Valley High School this morning as they were eager to witness Congresswoman Lauren Underwood's ceremonial swearing-in celebration.
I entered into the most diverse Congress in history. We dropped the average age of members of Congress by more than 10 years, and the largest class of women serving concurrently in American history. And so for the first time ever, the loudest, boldest, most powerful voices coming out of Capitol Hill were the voices of women.
Sexism was actually a really strong predictor of how people made their choice in the 2020 Democratic primary.
Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have been longtime allies, but now, for the first time, they're going after each other in public. Warren claims that Sanders told her he did not believe a woman could win the presidency.
When Warren said, Senator Sanders said that a woman shouldn't be the nominee in 2020, she was kind of basically calling out that kind of attitude, this notion that I might myself not be sexist, but I'm worried about other sexist voters, and because of that, I might prefer a male nominee just to be safe, just because I think a male nominee will be better against Trump in 2020. Sanders and Warren are two great examples because they have similar issue positions, similar portfolios and backgrounds. They talk about the same issues, and yet if you look at this sexism scale, you find that it's a really strong predictor. As people move more sexist on the scale, they become much more likely to be a Sanders supporter rather than a Warren supporter. One of the most controversial things I ever did was said in the Financial Times in 2016 that I did not think that Democrats should run a white woman in 2020. And I still don't. I'm really relieved we didn't. I loved Elizabeth Warren, But sexism goes really, really deep.
You know, there's not actually a lot of evidence that women vote for women. And frankly, I'd want to think really hard about why we would expect there to be. That a woman says, despite the fact that I've always supported this party, despite the fact that this party aligns with these values and these interests that I have, I'm going to vote for a woman just because she's a woman.
Just to be clear, you just committed here tonight that your running mate, if you get the nomination, will be a woman?
Yes.
This is history. Dana, if you're there, we are learning from Arlette. Kamala Harris has been selected as Joe Biden's running mate, making her the first black female vice presidential pick and first Asian female vice presidential pick.
I, for one, was insulted when months ago Joe Biden came out and he said, guess what? It's going to be a woman who's my running mate. Let's not worry about qualifications. Let's not worry about what they bring to the table.
One of the reasons that surprised me, she was probably nastier than even Pocahontas.
It's the most cliched thing, but I think of saying to my daughter, who's 4, who's half black and half Indian, look at Kamala Harris, right? Like, that could be you. And on the other hand, in my intellectual life, saying, I don't believe in descriptive representation. I don't believe that because Kamala Harris is a woman of color, she's going to represent my needs, because I don't think that's how representation works. And yet, given that black women have been the Democrats' most reliable voters, it feels really meaningful to have this moment where we're actually recognized, right? Because I feel like for so long, black women have done the heavy lifting for the party, and it's never been recognized sufficiently through black women holding political office.
People do respond when they see somebody on the ticket or see somebody get nominated to the bench who they know is going to have, you know, their shared experience. And you know which party really gets this is the Republican Party, ironically, because when they run in especially heavily Latino districts, they do excellent job recruiting Latino candidates. Do women lawmakers behave differently than male lawmakers? Do they introduce legislation that's different? Do they focus on different issues? In other words, are women better represented when there are more women at the table? And the answer is yes. So we know it's not just about feeling good or some kind of symbolic tokenism. It matters.
She's no stranger to making history, right? She was the first black woman to be DA and the first black woman to be attorney general in California and the first black woman, well, I think she was the first black person to be a statewide elected official in California and one of only 2 black women to ever serve in the Senate. And so, I think that conventional wisdom is changing along with so many other things in our country. And, I'm really excited about the opportunity to continue to break barriers and, all the rest moving forward.
I don't think there's any more of a culture war within feminism than there's ever been. Every generation has to feel that they have some ownership over the movements they're participating in.
Infighting is going to happen. And it's a part of everything we do. There's infighting in families, but we always somewhere find the things that bring us together in order to progressively move. And that's what's really important, especially in organizing work, right? We find the things that we have in common.
I just don't think it's fair to judge people, like, oh, here I am in 2020 and I have all this possibility and power that you didn't have in 1965 or 1980, and I'm judging you. Like, why couldn't you do it this way, When you're talking about a world where women couldn't get a divorce and guarantee access to their own children, You could get, it was legal for your husband to rape you well into the 80s. You know, this is people had to fight for. I'm the first generation of women that had even like somewhat credible claim of egalitarian life.
I'm not big into like attacking other feminists. You know, if you feel like you're working towards women's equality, I may not think that's the best way, but I'm not going to attack you. Life's too short. I have people who I don't share deep values with, and I will save my fire for them.
I'm of the mind that disconnects are productive. I don't think disconnects are a problem. My ideal concept of contemporary feminism is that we have lots of really generative, fruitful, loud, passionate, engaged disagreements. What I think feminists share is a commitment to some vision of freedom, right? To some sense that the world that we live in feels intolerable for so many of us. If that's our shared goal, we can and should disagree about what to do about the conditions of the present to make life more livable. I think we're debating big questions, right? Fundamentally, we're asking, what will it mean for us to be free?